Okay, I think we should be recording now and we should be good to go. So, like I said, I really appreciate we're very far into the very last weeks of the course. So, I really appreciate all of your work and everything you put in. And I think that you're going to find out that you're going to walk away with a very strong grade if you've submitted everything, all the work by this stage. There's still going to be a couple of chances also to collect extra points if someone has missed some of the work and kind of wants to catch up on those. So there's few ways they can go about it. Either submit the work that they missed, or then pick up those extra points elsewhere and bring up their grade where they want to be. But in the interest of time, I'm going to make a start. And like I said, if someone joins us a little late, we'll just bring them up to speed. It's week 15, I believe. And it's the female reproductive system that we're going to have a look of this week. However, before doing so, I want to go through a couple of practical things. Like there's always these announcements that we've been doing at the beginning of the session. And I actually have very much or pretty much the exact same thing written up as an announcement. I just haven't yet posted it, because what's important for me is that anyone who joins on these sessions gets the information first, gets the full explanation of the information. So we'll go through the same stuff that I'll post, but I encourage you both to check out the announcement and also these videos. A few times I've found out that students who don't necessarily check the general part of these videos might be a little confused or might have questions that might have gotten covered in these videos. So I always encourage everyone, if they can't join live, then checking these videos at least. But you're doing good since you're here. So like I said, at this stage, I've now gotten everything that has been submitted by last night graded, and there should be a grade for every single piece of assignment that's been done. If there's not a numeric grade, then I do strongly encourage contacting me, letting me know. Sometimes the transfer, especially from the Connect to Canvas, does not work, and especially if there are extensions or things like that are in place. But I think every single assignment should be open till December 13th, but I still encourage that try to get them in when you have a chance. I'm not rushing anyone. I don't want you to sacrifice the other work, other courses that you're taking, but sooner we get your grade finalized, the easier it is for you to know that you're going to get the exact grade that we've discussed about. If you leave submitting the last things, and I'm not referring to persons who are here with me on this video, I'm talking in general. If assignments are submitted at the last minute, the student kind of loses that chance to have that dialogue, checking that everything is as they expect. So I really, really encourage going to the grade record here on Canvas and just looking through everything. Does it show up a numeric grade in every assignment that you submitted? That's the first thing. And then, of course, does it show up a numeric grade that makes sense, that you were expecting to see? And if it doesn't, and even if it does, I encourage always checking out the written feedback or grading matrix if either one is provided. I do try to honestly take time to write for every student individual feedback. Usually, unfortunately, which I do think is horrible, but that's just the reality of the life, that usually there's more feedback on questions that students have missed, because I try to expand on that student why they missed it. But if you've gotten everything right, you should still have feedback somewhere on the exam, or somewhere on the practical, or in another assignment that you've submitted, if it's something that I manually grade. And what else did I have? And if your grade is not where you want it to be, I'm actually going to be sharing a little bit of details today that what you can do, how you can bring it up, and so on. But like I said, I really, really ask that students would review their grades as soon as possible. It doesn't have to be right on this second, but let me know if there's anything. And I think that the assignments that I've listed here are probably the most important ones to check, because these are assignments where I think that I have most to do in terms of manually grading components on those. So we have the icebreaker, the first week where you posted, I think that you answered a couple of introduced yourself and answered whether you like to live on at the bottom of the sea or on the sea or at the moon or space or something like that. It was really to get us going, see that you're able to use the discussion board. So there should be points for anyone who took part on that. Then we had the exam 1 and exam 2 and also exam 3. I should add that there. And all of those had verbal feedback for students. I'm just going to add the exam 3. For students, both for right and wrong questions. So check those 3 exams. For the practicals, we had practical 1 and 2. Practical 3 we did not complete manually because there were so many issues with the technology there, but you might see that now it's available. So every student has gotten full marks for that assignment, but there's a chance to earn extra points also by still doing that assignment. In addition, I think that we had for immunology an assignment where you looked at the website and filled in answers on a sheet and then submitted that to me through the Canvas. Then we had a critical thinking assignment where we looked at the water, electrolyte, and pH balance. I think that there were, I want to say, 2 scenarios, case studies that you looked at and provided answers. So all of that should be also graded with the grading matrix and written feedback. In terms of that, I really want to share that I normally want, if your answer exceeds what would be full marks, I normally want to give extra credit, but that was the only assignment where I have not given extra credit. And that's because all of the grades, and no student is identifiable as an individual, but we're looking whole, not just whole class, but whole school. All of the students' scores get put together, and then we analyze how are we doing in addressing those critical thinking questions that we assess for the Higher Learning Commission and as a college as a whole. So few times my heart was bleeding because I really, really wanted to give extra credit, but I can only give the maximum number of points. But even still, I'd say that I make notes and I remember who would have been worthy of extra points, and I'll address them later on. Then we had for male and female reproductive system, for those labs, I think that we had for male, you looked at forensic examination of semen, and then for the female reproductive system, which we are looking today, it's going to be about embryonic development. So we don't actually have a separate chapter looking at the embryonic development and life cycle of an individual, which I think is a real shame because that's probably one of the most interesting topics in my personal view, since that's what I've spent many, many years researching, doing embryonic research with the fetuses and embryos. But you will learn about that by doing that assignment where, again, you write answers submitted on Canvas, and then I grade them manually. So those would be the assignments that I would especially check because you should have feedback on those. But like I said, sometimes there's issues with the transfer from the Connect to Canvas. And if there's anything that even makes you doubt a little bit, I really, really encourage you to contact me. Sooner we get those addressed, sooner we can finalize your grade. I recommend either contacting me at the end of one of these sessions or by sending me a message on Canvas. And if you don't hear back to that message, resend it. I try to check also emails and so on, but just because there's, I think, in a day on average between 50 and 75 emails, and so things can get buried. So I just want you to get your answer. So can always contact me. Don't hesitate about that. That's all I have on mind about the grades. If I miss anything, I will definitely talk about that either in the announcement or we'll jump back to that. Exam 3, I went through that. The only big thing that on exam 3 we didn't have extra credit question, which I normally try to include, but because of all the technical issues, I didn't want to delay the exam 3 getting published, so I didn't actually really come up with the extra credit question on that. But I have collected a couple of questions that were most commonly challenging questions, and we're really quickly going to review through those. Usually the students who are present or watch these recordings didn't miss those, so it feels a little silly for me to make them sit through me highlighting these, but it really is for the reason that those were questions that class as a large kind of overlooked. However, I do want to share with you that standard was very, very high again, and also the fact that unlike in most of my other courses where the final exam is questions from the previous exams that you've seen, your final project, you are not going to go, it's not cumulative, it doesn't go back to the exams that you've already taken. What you've taken is taken, and we move on to new topics. But I think it's still, you might want to know if you missed something, what would have been the right way to approach. But I'm going to go through these rather quickly. So the first question in the exam, I think, was about the function and main function of the respiratory system. And of course, that was about getting oxygen in and carbon dioxide out. But I had provided on those answer options nutrients in pretty much all other answer options. And I realized since we have been speaking about digestive system, we have been speaking about vascular system, how they transport nutrients, it's easy to get carried away and that comes to your mind. But really, respiratory system does not carry nutrients. It carries the gases, but it's not nutrient transport. That's something that we would worry about with the respiratory systems as its main function. So that's just something to bear in mind. Then I had a question about yawning. I think that during the lecture videos, I did discuss quite extensively that it was all about compensating for the low oxygen levels. That's an immediate response that our body kicks in. When the oxygen levels are low, we get more air in by recruiting our mouth rather than just breathing through the nose. And then that yawning is almost a reflex-like response, so we can't stop it. If you're about to yawn, you are about to yawn. And we often find that we say yawning spreads in a classroom or in space, that if one person yawns, the next one will start yawning. It's not really, there might be a psychological component, but it's not really about being bored or uninterested, which was an answer that many students offered. I hope that it was students being humorous and not actually believing that, because that really would be psychological response. And I highlighted in the lecture video, I highlighted on the reviews that we're not really doing the psychological aspect here. We're focusing on what's the anatomy and physiology, and compensation for the low oxygen levels was that. Then we had a question, and that was the probably only question where I have really spent a lot of time assessing the anatomical language and especially the directions. And I was surprised most of the students really struggled with this. And again, I'm not judging anyone, I'm just trying to set you up for success. These are the terms that you will use in medical field if you're going to any medical field, if you're going and continuing your studies. It is like the vocabulary that we have in English. That's the vocabulary of the medical field. These are the terms that we use. And I think these normally get covered on BIO 201 at the very beginning. And often it's easy to think that, okay, now I've done it, I don't have to think about it again. But these are something that you really, really do want to be familiar and comfortable with. So I have listed them there, and I'm going to take just a few moments to review them. But what's really important for me is that you remember that don't overlook, even though something has been covered in the past, it doesn't mean that it's not important anymore. So we know all anterior and posterior, so anterior the front side, posterior the back side. We also have terms ventral and dorsal, and I think that these are the ones that we hear less often being used in human anatomy and physiology. But if you go to veterinary sciences, you do anything with animals that are not standing on 2 feet, you'll notice that the terms ventral and dorsal are used very largely. So ventral refers to the belly side. If you have a dog, for example, it's their inferior side, so bottom side. If you have a dog, their ventral side would be their very top, so superior side. But of course, in terms of an anatomy of a human being or any other animal that stands on 2 legs, anterior and ventral will be synonymous, and posterior and dorsal will be synonymous. But there's a reason why we introduce this other set of terms, not just to make students' life horrible, but also just because if we do have an animal that doesn't align exactly like us, we might prefer to use those terms. Superior and inferior should be familiar terms. So superior is something that's above you. If you think of being at work, your superior, your boss, is in a rank above you. You might be inferior to your boss in a rank, so you're below them. We have discussed about lateral, which is on the sides of the midline, and the medial is aligning with the midline or close to the midline. And I think that this was the question that we had here about the conchi, that from where do they extend within the nasal cavity. And I got all sorts of other responses than the one that I was looking, that they come from the roof of the nasal cavity or floor of the nasal cavity. That was not the case, of course. Familiar ones, I don't think that these are tough for anyone. Superficial and deep, being close to the surface or deep within the body. But you wouldn't say that, oh, it's on the surface of the skin. You would say superficial layers of the skin. Remember also, whatever you write in medical notes, that becomes a legal document. So if you have to go to the court, or if you get asked to the court, your deck documents become relevant, and you want to appear smart. You want to appear that you know what you're talking, and part of that is using the correct terminology. Proximal and distal, often used when we have limbs or blood vessels. Proximal is close to the starting point. Distal is further away from there. So we can talk about blood vessels as we move more distally or as we move more downstream. That's another one that can be sometimes discussed, especially when we talk about physiology. So when we are moving in the event pattern further, or in the, for example, nerve impulse. I'm just going to add that. And the last one that I had here is cephalic and caudal. Cephalic towards the head, caudal towards the tail. I think that there's other that are more of then cavity related, like cranial towards the skull and so on. But really, I don't want to spend too much time on this. I just want to highlight that these are important ones to know. So make sure you know those. And here you see that the correct answer, of course, about the conchi was the lateral walls where they extended from. So they would not be inferior, because that would mean that they would come up from the floor of the nasal cavity. That'd be kind of weird. Then I had a question about the false and true vocal cords. I get it, this was kind of a tricky one. So I'm just highlighting. Remember with those that there's two sets of vocal cords. The more superior one is nothing but just a tissue folds. They're not actually involved with the voice production. The true vocal cords are the lower, inferior set of vocal cords, and they vibrate and generate the pitch, the tone, as the air flows through them. So just something to be aware of. I think that sometimes, in my view, the questions that are true false might be more difficult than the questions where you would have even short essay answer, because we tend to sneak in little mistakes to those. So they become very, very challenging. So this was something to pay attention to with this question. So I just wanted to highlight that. I had a question about infant accidentally ingesting a small toy. And this was the concept that we have looked at before, and I'm trying to get a pen again, that the right bronchi entered the lungs in a steeper angle than the left bronchi. So usually an object that goes to the lungs, especially, this is common with the kids, we end up noticing that it goes to the right lung because of this steeper angle that we find there. So that was the basis why I was asking that question. But I did throw in as one of the answer options this hyoid bone, that an object would get stuck on the hyoid bone. Remember, that's the bone up here that's not actually physically attached to any other bone in the body. So that's kind of one of those odd bones, but that's embedded within tissues, soft tissues. So objects really wouldn't get caught to that. They would slide through the tubing that goes through that part. So there's really not a bone for the objects to attach. But I can see how reasoning could have taken one into that answer, but unfortunately that was not the right answer. Remember, hyoid bone is the one, if someone gets strangled, that usually is the bone that breaks. And we look at that a lot in the forensic applications, that when we're trying to figure out cause of death and so on. But that's not also black and white. There can be someone having gotten strangled without a broken hyoid bone. So that's just one of the common things that we look. Then we had questions about the respiratory volumes. In general, I really don't think that there's much I can say about it, other than that these are unfortunately one of those things that we just have to memorize. Anatomy and physiology has certain things. You can try to ration it out or think it out. If you can come up with some sort of a thinking mechanism, that's also often very, very useful way to approach that, because then you're going to remember it better. But on these ones, it's just unfortunately memorization. Since you can use your notes in the exams, it is a good idea to at least have good notes or know where you can find the answers from your notes. And I think that I've been pretty good with the review guides. There's really rarely questions outside those. So I would spend the time when preparing to make sure that you feel comfortable with the content on those. And then I had a couple of questions about nephrons. And this was really another one of those where you just either kind of know it or you don't know it. And I don't think nephron really is a structure that you just get an kind of an all moment and it all makes sense. It's just memorization, especially the anatomy on that and the terminology that we have for that. But I do think that I said during the chapter where we covered the urinary system, we spent quite a lot of time looking at nephron, and I said that that would be a structure in the review session, that would be a structure that I would know. So I think that the ones again who are watching the video or are present in these review sessions usually ace that, but the ones who did not ace it usually did not necessarily pay attention to the review session or something threw them off. So I did give extra credit if you got all of the nephron parts correctly, because that showed me that you had done that extra work. So just, again, like I said, something that there's not really a quick way or easy fix, just memorization. And if there's any unclarities of those, like I said at the beginning, with the questions, with the grading, I'm always happy to discuss through those. Check what I've given also in individual feedback and also on the automated feedback. We had one question about the water content, and I haven't yet gotten back, but one student said that the options were not correct that were offered. So that's why I added it to here. I do think that the options that are being offered, there is a correct order of options, but I'm not trying to attack the students. It's always good. Feel free to question what I offer as an answer. Sometimes I do mistakes. Sometimes any one of us makes mistakes. But on this one, I'm pretty much certain that I've got this figured out. So we listed the water content within the human bodies. Different kinds of humans based on age and based on sex, from the individuals with the highest water content to individuals with the lowest water content. And of course, there's individual variation, but we were looking at general groups, and we noticed that it's the infants that have the most water in their body out of the list that we had a look at. So their water content is higher than any other of these groups that we had a look. After that, we noticed that males had more water content than females. And this really relates directly to the fact that female body, and this is not to say that this is the case with everyone, but in general, female body contains a little bit more fat tissue, and this has an evolutionary reason because females need that little extra storage of energy since they're in an evolutionary sense likely to carry the child, and that's a huge challenge, huge process for the body. So having that little extra is important. So adipose tissue contains less water than other tissue types. So that's why males have more water content than females. And the last group that I had listed here was the elderly. And we remember that the water content was lowest within the elderly. Again, not to shame older people or anything. That's just one of the changes that we notice happening over a lifetime. So that was that. Now, let's have a look of the missing assignments. I think I've used this exact same slide in the past. If you have any missing assignments or assignments that you want to retake, and this does include also exams and practicals, there is an opportunity for that. I'm willing to discuss that. I'm willing to have a look that could you retake something, or if you hadn't had a chance to take that assignment, you now want to go back and get those points. What I really, really ask you to do is message me directly. Canvas messages is usually the best way, and be very specific what it is. If you just say in general that, oh, I would like to retake the labs from early in the course, it's really hard for me to go and open up everything for one student. If you're very specific which weeks, what was the name of the assignment, it's more likely that that request will be fulfilled, and that will be fulfilled quickly. So be specific if you can. That helps both of us in terms of getting that addressed. And that also went for the exams and practicals if you have any questions. There is going to be a chance for extra credit. And I'm going to first discuss the practical tree because that's something that's already available. And that's going to be in the announcement that I'm sending out after this session. But on practical 3, everyone got full marks automatically because of the technical issues that we were facing. However, it is now accessible. It is a take at home activity. It's open book. So if you take that, any points that you gain in the practical 3 count as extra credit in addition to those full marks that you already earned. And I think that it was possible to earn on the practical 3, if I don't remember wrong, there is a chance that I'm mistaken, that's always an option. I think it was 50 points. And that's supposed to be 5. Sorry about my bad handwriting. So everyone has automatically 50 points out of 50. But you can earn up to 100 points for this assignment. However, the catch is that I will only put the grades or the points that the computer automatically assigns for you. So I won't go manually reading through those answers. So if there's a spelling error or something doesn't align, then unfortunately there won't be points for that. So again, I recommend doing those practicals so you see every question that might come up. But that's a first chance that we have to earn extra points. The second place where you can earn extra points, and on this one, I don't know why we jumped backwards. On this one, there's probably more extra points available. This is the finals week project. There's extra points available there as well. And you will see exactly how many extra points for doing what in the grading rubric. And I haven't shared the grading rubric yet for the reason that I want us to finish the exams for this last set of chapters before I share that. Finals week project is not going to take you more time than you would normally spend on a typical week on this course. So I'm not doing anything that's a huge amount of time away from studying other things. So don't worry about that. That's usually students score full marks or more than full marks on that. But it is something that you have to do. If you don't do it, you don't get the points. You will still pass the course if you have enough points to pass the course. But I just want to make the finals week easier for you. You don't have to memorize things. There's 3 ways how you can submit your work for the finals week. So you can find a way that works the best for you. Again, in terms of the extra credit, don't leave it to the last day of the course. If you leave it to the last day of the course and then I grade it after the deadline has passed and you don't get those points that you wanted, it's harder to figure out what to do next with you at that point. If you do it earlier and I grade it earlier and we see exactly where you're standing with your grade, that leaves us a little bit of time to react to any issues that you might have. So I realize that you have a lot of other things going on. This is not the only course you're taking, but I really do encourage you, try to get this stuff in as early as you can. I'm not here to catch anyone out. I'm not here to prevent anyone from getting the grades that they're after. But if you leave everything to the last minute, it's really hard for me then to have that chance to have that dialogue with you. Oh, that was the shaky animation that I did. But this week, there's 4 pieces of assignments that we'll be doing. And I think 3 of these are familiar. We seem to have it almost every week. So we do have the Learn Smart, where you read about the textbook, you answered questions. If you did all of it, you got full points. We have a quiz, we've done those before, and we had the anatomy practical. All of these were through the McGraw-Hill's Connect platform. And again, let me know if you don't see your points. Let me know if the points are not what you expect them to be when they transfer from there to the Canvas. But they should be in order. The only difference from the Connect is the lab, which is about embryonic development, and that is through the Canvas. So it's one of those, you've done those before already, where you submit the answer through the Canvas. There's a grading matrix, and then I grade it there. I always encourage, if you are provided the grading matrix, I would definitely, as a student, use that as an opportunity to see what's being asked from me. So check the grading matrix. Even before you submit it. Because that shows you what's required for what number of points. And I think that was especially true in the critical thinking assignment. If you knew exactly what you were asked to do, then it was easy to give that many answers or that many individual observations that we were looking for. So I always encourage checking those. So we're going to next go through the female reproductive system and key parts of it. And just because I'm keeping, so I'm going to move to another PowerPoint, bear with me. And just because I had initially thought that, hey, let's draw it out like we did last week. But I'm looking at the time and I think that it might not be the smartest of things for us to do. We'll have a look if we get a chance to draw it. But if we don't have time, we'll just do it through the PowerPoints. So there's not a huge amount of information on this one again. It's not something where you would see things that would be an overwhelming amount of material to cover, but it's a little bit more complex than a male system. And we'll have a look of why in a second once I get this up. So you should be now seeing the lecture slides for the female reproductive system. And we'll have a look of general stuff first and move on to study the reproductive tract. That's where the most of the A&P comes together. And then we'll also spend a bit of time looking at the hormonal control, because on female, that's especially varied. There's a lot to know, more than in a male, not only just because there's the female menstrual cycle. So throughout the month, there's a lot of changes going on, but also because then there's the chance of pregnancy, and that changes the hormonal control of the reproductive system as well. And we mentioned a couple of words about mammary glands, but I'm not going to go into great details of those. So just to get us oriented, it is really a system that's going to be more complex than what we saw on the males. And one of the important things that I want to highlight here, and I'm just trying to get a highlighter up, was that we want to remember that gonads were the primary sex organs. And in case of females, it's going to be the ovaries that we're looking at. So ovaries are the female primary reproductive organ. Everything else is accessory organs. And we remember that gonads, whether they were female ovaries or whether they were males, they were had a twofold function: to produce the sex cells in case of a female ova or oocyte, so egg cell, and also the sex hormones. And in case of female, it's going to be estrogen and progesterone that we're looking at. So be familiar with those. Those are what the ovaries do. And everything in this system that we're having a look started with the ovaries. In terms of the system, we end up finding that we had that ovaries and a duct system, and then we have external genitalia. We can talk about that a little bit. I don't know why that highlight now decided to stay. I'm not quite sure. I didn't mean to do that as a permanent one. Let's see if it allows me to erase it. Unfortunately not. That looks better. So this is an introduction. I showed that there's a lot of structures that we know. For example, from the past, we would know the urinary bladder. We've discussed about that before. And from for how from out of there we had then our urethra coming out. And then we're going to have a bunch of other structures. But we're really focusing on the, I don't know if this is going to work, on the female reproductive tract. And these diagrams, I think, are challenging because they show everything. So this is a nice mid-sagittal section, but they show everything aligned in a way that we can't see everything at the same time. So we're going to do better. We're going to draw a diagram that's not totally anatomically correct, but it basically lays out the entire female tract in a flat level, so it's easier to learn. So we're gonna look at, and our drawing is actually gonna end up looking like something that you see here. And I'm just looking at the time. I think we can do it. I think we can draw out the female reproductive system ourselves. So if you do have, and I'm just gonna open this because I want to remove this from a blank page. If you do have a pen and a paper, that would be useful. If you have a colored pen and a paper, if you learn that way, that might be useful as well. So we're going to go through the different parts of the female reproductive tract by drawing it out ourselves. And this really combines the anatomy and physiology, so it's worth of doing. So the primary sex organ of a female was, of course, our ovary. And ovary had a twofold function. So ovary, in addition to producing the egg cell, so in addition of having a function to producing the ova or oocyte, it also produced this female sex hormones. What's important to notice in terms of the ovary is that when it sheds the egg cell doesn't actually move from the ovary to the next part of the female reproductive tract directly. It rather travels to the peritoneal cavity, to the space outside the female reproductive tract. So the egg is shed outside this tract that we'll see. It just floats around there free. And then we get to the next structure. The next structure that we see, so I'll just add it. I'm thinking, where should I fit all of this? Let's put it here. So we learned that we had ovary and it had a purpose of doing the egg cell, but also the hormones. The sex hormone. The next part that we're going to see is going to be something that we call, and let me just move this screen. Fimbriae. Fimbriae are these little, if you wish to describe them somehow, like finger-like projections coming from the uterine tube or fallopian tube. So they are part of the fallopian tube, but we have identified a few different parts from the fallopian tube, and the first one of those is gonna be the fimbriae. Their function is really to be around and be able to catch that egg cell. So that's why we have those. They are there so that they're able to catch that egg cell that floats to the space outside the reproductive tract. So these finger-like projections that have a function of simply catching the egg cell from the outside the reproductive tract, they were known as fimbriae. The next part that we're going to have a look is, again, another part of the uterine tube or fallopian tube, but it has a specific function, and that's going to be Infundibulum. And that's a funny sounding word. Well, what it is basically this kind of a triangle shaped part of the fallopian tube, uterine tube. And if you think its function, the function would be really to be this funnel that directs the egg cell that has been caught by the fimbriae to travel to a right direction. So it's kind of guiding the egg cell that it proceeds onwards down the reproductive tract to the right direction. So it's kind of this funnel that directs it where it needs to go. Then we get to the longest part that we're going to see in the uterine tube or fallopian tube. So let's list here. That's supposed to say uterine or fallopian. Tube. And that can be divided into two different parts. First part, and I'm going to put them on this side, is going to be ampulla. So that's P. And the second part is going to be our isthmus. So ampulla is, if we look, and this is over exaggerated, but it's good to over exaggerate when we do diagrams because we're able to convey a key idea by emphasizing the characteristics that are important. Ampulla is this kind of a wiggly part of the uterine tube. So this part has a lot more bends and is much more varied in terms of its shape than the rest of the uterine tube. So this part was known as our ampulla. And I want to talk a little bit about ampulla separately in terms of its physiology as well, because that's going to be important for us to know. So this part are ampulla. And what ampulla is important, or what do we need to know about that? Well, ampulla has a very thin wall. So that's the thinnest part in terms of the wall of the uterine or fallopian tube. And it's also the longest part of that. And what's really important in terms of ampulla? This is the site where fertilization takes place. So the egg cell meets the sperm here within the ampulla of the female reproductive tract. So at this point, if you look the final diagram that we'll do, sperm has actually traveled quite far within the female reproductive tract. So I'm always surprised when I think about this and when I've seen on Real Human Remains this amount of the journey that sperm actually travels before it meets the egg cell typically. So to make the journey all the way to the ampulla, that's quite a way. Of course, the egg cell has traveled quite a way as well. It's actually managed to make its way back to the reproductive tract from having floated around elsewhere, as we saw here. At the beginning of the diagram. So that's an important site to remember. I could see myself, I haven't yet written your test for the next week, but that would make a really good question, asking where the fertilization occurs in the female reproductive tract. And the remaining part of the uterine tube or fallopian tube was our isthmus. Isthmus has a thick wall. And if we think of it, it's about 2 centimeters long. So about this in length. It's not very long at all in comparison to the other parts. And again, I'm trying to put a highlighter so we can highlight that part separately. So that's isthmus. But do remember that all of this that we have covered so far was part of the uterine tube or fallopian tube. So that's an important one to remember, that they're just subparts. Well, now we've covered almost everything we need to remember. The last part that we need to review about the female reproductive tract is going to be the uterus. And I'm going to draw the uterus, but I'm going to draw it in a simplified manner where we're highlighting the parts that really matter to us. So I'm going to draw it first just to make my life a little easier. And then we're going to name different parts from there. And remember, this is a diagram, so things are not in scale always, but we're trying to highlight what's important, what we really want to know about the female reproductive tract. And I'm going to color it in, and that will make it also more visible if you're wondering what are these shapes and why do they matter. So I'm looking, where can I fit them? I can fit them. So this is all going to be our uterus. We're going to have a look of 3 different parts of the uterus. And these are important in terms of the terms because these terms will be used when we're, for example, trying to monitor pregnancy. Is it progressing the way we expect it to progress? Are there issues? So the very top part of the uterus is called fundus. And we've heard this term before. That was always the very high spot or top spot of a part. And I'm going to have to reuse certain colors, so don't let that throw you off. So fundus is the roof of the uterus, the thick tissue wall at the top of the uterus. Then we move on to the probably largest part of the uterus, which is going to be our body. Body of the uterus is about 2/3 of the entire size of the uterus. So let's color that in there. Wouldn't we have used? I think this is a color that we haven't used. So it covers the 2/3 of the uterus, the main part, the largest part, the fleshy, if you wish to use that word. I don't know if that's fully appropriate. The thick wall of the uterus is the body, so the largest part there. And the remaining last part of the uterus is gonna be our cervix. So, for example, when we take a cervical smear, we take it from the bottom part of the uterus. That's about the remaining 1/3 of the uterus. Which color wouldn't I have used? I don't think I've used this color. Oh, let me just get a highlighter. So it's not going to take that long to color that in. So here we have the body of the uterus forming the inferior 1/3 of the uterus. You'll notice that there's one more part, and I promise that's the last part that we need to know about the female reproductive tract, and that's gonna be our vagina there. And I'm again trying to just find a color that we wouldn't have used too much, so we're not gonna make our diagram too unclear. So you'll notice how cervix continues a little bit into the vagina. So that's why we're able to access it that fairly easily. That's really the female reproductive tract. I just want to highlight one more point here to remind us. So uterus was all this. I have just highlighted different parts. So what do we need to know about the uterus in terms of the physiology? We've mentioned a few things already, but just again to make those points more obvious, we remember the site of fertilization was within ampulla. Egg cell first leaves the ovary, travels to the pelvic cavity and gets picked up by the fimbriae from the pelvic cavity. Then travels down from fimbriae to infundibulum, and from the infundibulum it travels to the ampulla, which was the site of fertilization. Once the egg cell has fertilized, we've got about 2 to 3 days for the egg cell to travel to the uterus, where it then implants. So these time delays between different events are important because during this time, from the moment when the sperm and egg cell fuse together, this fertilized cell now starts dividing. In about 2 to 3 days, it has divided enough that now it's a viable lump of cells. And if this is a sensitive topic, I do apologize. I don't want to use crude words if someone has different beliefs. But from my perspective, it's a lump of cells that then attaches to the uterine wall lining. So this is why the uterine wall lining grows thick and vascular and has also glandular appearance during the menstrual cycle. So it's ready to receive this egg cell. The egg cell can easily attach into the uterus wall. And where we would ideally like to have the egg cell attaching is either to the body or fundus of the uterus. We would ideally not like to have the egg cell attaching to the cervix. And if you think about it, why cervix is not an ideal place for an egg cell to attach, it makes sense that when you think about that, we're going to grow a placenta from the fetus and then embryo. And if this placenta crosses over the opening of cervix, there's a great risk that during delivery, placenta deattaches and the baby is starved of oxygen. So this is why we do at the early stages of the pregnancy an ultrasound to identify where the fertilized egg cell has attached, so we can stop the process if it's not going to be viable pregnancy. We don't really want to encourage full-term pregnancy if there's no chances of survival. Alternatively also, it doesn't mean that the pregnancy is doomed if the egg cell attaches to the cervix, but having that knowledge gives us the tools that we can then be at the time of delivery prepared to this. So again, these early ultrasounds are very, very useful for that reason. I used to teach ultrasound, so that's why I talk a lot about that. It's a cheap medical imaging technique. We can achieve a lot of information with that. I think that's in terms of the physiology that I can think of from this diagram. We have really covered a lot. Only thing remaining is to talk about the hormonal control. So you can see the exact same things being drawn in this diagram that I drew on a computer. It's a little bit prettier, but still the concept is the same. We've got a couple of ligaments that anchor the ovary and the rest of the reproductive tract to its site. You can review those from the full lecture notes. So ovarian ligament attaches the ovary to the uterine wall or uterus. Suspensory ligament anchors the ovary and uterine tube to the pelvic wall. And then we've got a broad ligament which kind of covers all of that as a sheath, and things are held in place with that as well. The next part is gonna be important. And I know that it looks like, oh my goodness, there's gonna be so much to cover when you see this diagram. Yes, it has a lot going on, but that summarizes everything you'll ever need to know about female hormonal cycle. And I didn't mean to move ahead. I have a little bit super sensitive screen now. I might need to research why. But we're going to go through this step by step. And we go back to our good old friend hypothalamus, which secreted and passed messages to anterior pituitary gland. So this is why we spend so much time talking about the hypothalamic anterior pituitary or hypothalamic pituitary axis. So hypothalamus controls pituitary, which then controlled the release of two hormones, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. I'm sure you remember those hormones. We have mentioned them, but we have not discussed about them that much. So now this is where we start to add meat to what we're seeing. But we remember that we're going to have follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone secreted from the anterior pituitary gland. Well, let's see what each one does. So follicle stimulating hormone does what the name suggests. It drives the development of a follicle. So follicle is this lump of cell mass around the egg cell. So egg cell develops inside the follicle in the female ovary. And we are looking at a single egg cell. Typically during one single menstrual cycle, only one egg is released. There are different follicles at different parts of the development, but we're now following only one follicle. So once the follicle has developed as driven by the follicle stimulating hormone, there's going to be a spike of luteinizing hormone. And this luteinizing hormone spike triggers the process of ovulation. So the egg cell is shed from this follicle around day 13 or 14 of the menstrual cycle. So first, follicle stimulating hormone drives the development of the follicle, and then luteinizing hormone drives the ovulation, the shedding of the egg cell from the follicle. Well, what is left behind is going to be an interesting structure. What's left behind is known as corpus luteum. Corpus luteum is basically the remaining part of the follicle minus the egg cell. And what you'll notice is that it starts to slowly change its shape, its structure, but it also takes over a very important hormonal regulation role in the reproductive system of the female. So this corpus luteum starts to secrete two hormones that we've seen before, estrogen and progesterone. And estrogen has a role secreted by the corpus luteum of promoting this thickening of the uterine wall lining. So we want to make the uterine wall lining, so the wall of the uterus, really thick, nice and fleshy for the egg cell to implant into. We want to make sure that that egg cell has something to connect into once it reaches the uterus after having gotten fertilized. If it doesn't get fertilized, these events still happen due to the corpus luteum, but it just doesn't attach because there's no need for it to attach. So that was the role of estrogen secreted by the corpus luteum. Corpus luteum also secretes progesterone, and progesterone has a function of making this uterine wall lining that's now thick, also very vascular. So there's a lot of blood vessels. There's, in addition to these blood vessels, a lot of glandular appearance. So the wall is this kind of a has a lot of gaps, a lot of blood vessels there. Why would that make sense? Well, that makes sense because it's easier for the egg cell to attach to this glandular and vascular wall. And remember, the egg cell will slowly start developing the placenta. Well, this would be good for the placenta to then develop, and also for the egg cell to get the resources, nutrients, other stuff that it needs to develop further. So now, one of two things can happen. Either there can be no fertilization or there's a fertilization. Let's have a look if there's no fertilization. The egg cell does not get fertilized. Well, in that case, the corpus luteum will keep degenerating. It just slowly degenerates, and because it degenerates, it's no longer gonna secrete these hormones that we saw before. It's no longer going to secrete estrogen, and it's no longer going to secrete progesterone. When those are not secreted, we are no longer maintaining this thickness of the uterine wall lining. We're no longer maintaining this glandular and vascular appearance of the uterine wall lining. What happens instead is that because there's no corpus luteum, there's no estrogen, there's no progesterone, the menstruation happens. We are gonna shed all of this uterine wall lining that's no longer useful for us since there was no successful fertilization. There's not gonna be successful attachment of a fertilized egg cell. So we're gonna get rid of that wall in the uterus, and we're going to start preparing for the next egg cell to be successful in attaching. So this is the reason why we see the menstrual bleeding taking place. We're getting rid of this uterine wall lining that we prepared. And menstrual bleeding takes place somewhere between day 26 and a couple of early days of a cycle. So that's where we are shedding the wall line. Well, if fertilization does take place, in that case, corpus luteum gets salvaged. We maintain the corpus luteum. It remains as it is. So none of these later stages happen. And because we are salvaging the corpus luteum, we are going to be still producing estrogen, and we are still going to be producing progesterone. So the uterine wall lining is maintained as thick, as vascular, and as glandular. So the egg cell is going to be able to attach there, it's going to be able to develop there and grow into what we want it to grow, which is going to be the fetus and then embryo, becoming a successful pregnancy and giving birth to a child. That might seem like a lot to take in, but that really is everything you need to know about female menstrual cycle control. I love this diagram. I've drawn this diagram, and I've drawn it on purpose of combining so many things that happen. Combining the hormonal changes, combining the changes that we see on a single follicle that develops the egg cell that gives rise to the corpus luteum, providing actually the anatomical changes that we see on the uterine wall lining as well. Most textbooks have something similar to this diagram. They might not have as much detail, like arrows pointing and things so like that, but something that summarizes this process. And I really, really encourage you to get familiar with this diagram because I think it has everything you need to know about female reproductive system hormonal control, and also what happens whether there's fertilization or no fertilization. So that's why I'm kind of passionate about that diagram. Plus also, this is one of my favorite topics. Well, let's have a look at menstruation quickly. We talk about menses. Menses are the menstrual bleeding. First menstrual cycle these days takes place around age 13 or so. There's a lot of variation, but what we're noticing, the first menstrual cycle, which is known as menarche, is taking place earlier than ever before historically. So when I ask from students why this is the case, I often get answers that, well, it's because we have all these toxins and all these things that affect your hormones around us that may play a role. I personally, and this is just my personal view, but it's backed up with some science. So I think that it would be a fair exam question. I think that there's other explanations than just toxins and chemicals that we are exposed. What most textbooks fail to address that, well, we are, compared to our procedure, people that existed before us, let's say couple of hundreds years ago, I'm thinking of Vikings since I'm from that part of the world. Well, at that time, the nutrition was way worse. At that time, the life expectancy wasn't that great. But to become old enough to have the menstrual cycle starting, that was probably also delayed by the fact that there was not enough nutrients, there was not enough energy. All of this for a female, and that's why I think female body is pretty amazing in comparison to the male. All this is a huge amount of resources put in to maybe get pregnant or maybe not. Every month, a lot of resources are being put into that. And I think that's starting earlier than ever before, because now we are actually better equipped of having enough nutrients, having enough energy, being well enough fed and maintained. Is human body, and especially in a psychological sense, ready for becoming an adult at that stage? I think that there's a lot to be discussed in terms of psychology of that. Probably not. And of course, our culture is pushing for the early, making the young girls adults really early when they might not be psychologically ready. But remember that I don't just think it's chemicals, I don't think it's horrible things around us. It's probably also because we live better life than we've ever lived before in eyes of having enough resources. Well, the other concept to discuss a little bit about the menopause. We officially consider that menopause has started once there has been a full year of cessation, no longer menstrual periods. And that's usually around the age 50. And there's a lot of signs and symptoms that happen, and also the disappearance of the secondary sexual characteristics. So the voice can get lower, there's more facial hair, things like that. That can be a drastic change. I always wary away when there's drastic changes on the hormonal system, because that can trigger so much. So if I were asked to give hormonal treatment, I would be very wary of that, but I realize that sometimes it's super useful. We have been using the hormone replacement therapy for the women that go through menopause for quite a long time already. There are, though, some risks associated if you have certain genetic factors that predispose you, for example, for certain kind of cancers, breast cancers, and so on. So there's a little bit to think about that, but your doctor is going to be fully aware of all of this. So they can make the educated decision. I think it's amazing and it's important that we're able to do hormonal replacement therapy, though. That does help a lot. Do men get menopause based on the current understanding? Not, at least not as drastic. We are starting to talk about these days about lower testosterone levels and looking at replacement of that. But I'll leave that to another discussion. Female menopause definitely more striking, more there that we can consider. The last thing that I was going to say a couple of words about was going to be the mammary glands. Of course, we have mammary glands both on males and females, but the functional ones are only going to be on females. Their main function really is just the milk production to nourish the newborn. So that's why we have them. There's a bunch, it's a modified type of a sweat gland, and there's a bunch of lobules within the mammary gland that then all lead to ducts, which are known as alveolar ducts, which then open up the bigger ducts that are known as lacciferous ducts, and these then open up at the nipple. Areola is the color of darker skin around the nipple. I did not spend time on this review nor in the lecture videos to discuss about breast cancer. I think it's really important topic though, so I encourage you everyone to have a quick look of that. So that's the cancer cells when we have them in epithelial or connective tissue of the breast. Very common. Do remember men can get breast cancer too. Really the monitoring the self-examinations and screenings through mammography play key role in early detection of the breast cancers. We can talk a little bit about birth control in males. We mentioned that that was the cutting the vas deferens. If we go back to the female diagram that we drew, this one. It's a little busy at this stage. I'm sorry about that. In terms of female, where would we, if we do sterilization, we would either cut or tie the uterine tube, the fallopian tube. So that would be the site that we would work on to have a look if we do a female sterilization. You can have your tubes tied or you can have them cut. A much more difficult process, much more there to consider than with the male sterilization. So I would always recommend that let's have the male to consider that if there is a couple. But that's just my personal view. Of course, I'm not trying to convince you to anything that you don't agree with. Just a few words about infertility before we wrap up. Of course, that's all to do with being unable to get pregnant. Typically in clinical use or clinical relevance, we talk that someone is infertile when it's been a year of trying to get pregnant and that's not been successful. So that's the clinical diagnosis. 1 in 6 couples struggle with infertility. It's often due to the male. And I don't say that just to be mean, but I think it's worthwhile to remember that often the reason for infertility is a male because it's easier to check from a male as well. It doesn't take a lot to have a male to produce sex cells and have an access to those. To alter female to produce multiple egg cells at the same time as when we go through IVF, that's a huge hormonal project. There's many factors that play a role, of course, the sperm, as we said, but in terms of female tract, there can be structural, functional issues, there can be dietary issues, there can be hormonal issues, or there can be other medical reasons that are worth looking into. But really, we normally try to start with males. The big thing to notice, just a couple of words about IVF. If we have a patient or a couple that's going through IVF, because of the hormonal treatment, we're now going to have multiple follicles developing at the same time. So we have a greater risk of multiple pregnancies at the same time. So getting a bunch of fetuses and embryos developing all at once. So that's something to bear in mind. Very, very expensive and also very stressful treatment to go through. I'm not going to say a single word about STIs or STDs. That's something that you can read more from your textbook if that's something of an interest to you. I think it's good for everyone to be a little bit educated. And that really summarizes everything I wanted to say about the female reproductive tract. I'm going to stop this video, and what we are going to do, we're going to open the previous. It's just the summary. Let me do this. We're not gonna save. Let me just jump into the review slides. I apologize for the slight delay. For some reason, I'm not able to do multiple PowerPoints at the same time on a online teaching event. So we should be now having the correct PowerPoint open. And let me just share it with you. Perfect. So we're back to this review of what's important. Remember, like I said, try to check your grades if you at all can. That would be a great help, not just for me, but for yourself as well, so that everything that needs to be covered, we catch. If there's any issues, let's catch them as early as possible. So please, please, please check your grades, check your work. Let me know if there's any issues. And you also remember that there's chances for extra credit already available, the practical tree. So remember that that's available already for you to take. However, I'm not going to do a lot of grading on that. Simply whatever the computer automatically accepts as a correct answer, you'll get those points in addition to the 50 points that you already have. And then the finals week project, there's going to be a bunch of extra credit available. Again, it's not going to be something that you need to stress about. It's quick to do. It's something same or less of a time that you would normally spend on a typical week on this course. But there's a chance to get those extra points there as well. And just remember that the embryonic development lab is the lab that you submit through the Canvas. That's all I have for today. If there are any questions, I'm going to stop the recording so you can ask them. Otherwise, this is all I had. I really, really do appreciate that you have joined me. I know that you have a lot of other things, so I appreciate it. Next week, we are going to do our last exam. I didn't really do a slide of its own for this week, but it's the exact same stuff that we would normally do for the exam. Open book, can use textbooks, don't have to be proctored. You can do it at your home or wherever you wish. So we're going to have the review sessions. I give one review session on Monday, but one in morning, one in the evening, and one on Wednesday morning and one on Wednesday evening. And I really, really encourage you, if at all possible. I know that the people who are either present here or are watching the video, they are doing good on this, that they're staying on top of the workload. I really encourage the others as well to try to catch up with the workload next week at the latest. You don't want to be doing multiple weeks on the very last finals week of this course, because it also means that you have less chances to react if the grades are not where you want them to be. I have less chances to help you. I have to draw the line somewhere. So I'm not stressing out anyone or panicking anyone, but do try to catch up if you have a lot to catch up. This week and last week are lighter in amount of the content that we cover, in amount of exercises that you are expected to cover as assignments for the week. That's all I have for this week. I'm going to stop the recording now. If you have any questions, just let me know. If you don't have questions, I really, really thank you for joining me. And I will hopefully see you, if you're able to, at the review session next week. You are doing really well, and I think that will get you there where you want to be with the grades. Thank you.
Thank you.